If you're looking at a hostile foreign actor, we have one in Qatar that's cloaked as an ally. And anytime I bring this up, I'm sure anytime you bring this up, we constantly hear, well, they're hosting a U.S. base. I'm like, well, we don't have to let them do that. Having a base there should give us leverage. It shouldn't give the Qataris leverage. It shouldn't give Hamas leverage. It shouldn't give Tehran leverage.
This episode of Think Twice is sponsored by the Jewish Future Promise, ensuring a vibrant and thriving future for Jews and Israel. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. This week we have an important and timely conversation for you with veteran intelligence analyst Michael Pregent about Qatar's malign impact on the Middle East, diplomacy, and influence buying in the United States. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, you still don't have to wait a full week for more of our content. There is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel wherever you get your podcasts. Also, JNS's inaugural International Policy Summit will be held later this month in Jerusalem. Click the link in the description below to request registration in order to attend. And now to today's program. One of the most disturbing anomalies of American foreign policy is the rising influence of a small yet incredibly wealthy nation. The Gulf state emirate of Qatar is at one and the same time the world's leading funder of Islamist radicalism, the sponsor and funder of the leading source of Middle East misinformation in Al Jazeera, an important ally of Iran and a funder of Hamas, and also an ally of the United States and host to a vital U.S. airbase. That's confusing in and of itself. But what makes it even more troubling is the way the emirate uses its vast wealth to insinuate itself into international business circles and to buy influence across the globe, especially in Europe and the United States. This has long been a matter of concern for Middle Eastern analysts who have noted the way Qatar attempted to buy off whole sectors of American society, including educational and cultural institutions, as well as politicians of both parties, and even leaders of the Jewish community. But in the last few months, its role as a broker and mediator between the United States and Israel, Hamas, and Iran has not only put it back in the spotlight, the fact that President Donald Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, is not only compromised by his business dealings with Qatar, but also arguably has become its leading apologist, makes its role in not just the negotiations for a hostage release and ceasefire deal with Hamas and renewed efforts to stop Iran's nuclear program deeply troubling. How did Qatar become so powerful and influential? And why is it getting away with using its oil wealth to buy so much influence in the United States with not only little accountability, but relatively little scrutiny from the mainstream corporate media? One person who has been studying this issue for many years is Michael Pregent. Mike Pregent is a senior Middle East analyst, a former adjunct lecturer for the College of International Security Affairs, and a visiting fellow at the National Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. He is a former intelligence officer with over 28 years' experience working security, terrorism, counterinsurgency, and policy issues in the Middle East, North Africa, and Southwest Asia, including time spent trying to combat Iranian influence in Iraq as an advisor to that country's government. A military veteran, he served in Operations Desert Storm and Desert Shield, as well as a company commander in Afghanistan in 2002 and an advisor with Kurdish forces and as an expert on extremism at the U.S. CENTCOM. Mike Pregent, welcome back to Think Twice.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jonathan. I appreciate it.
Well, Mike, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you about Qatar and its growing influence. Just as from a 30,000 foot view, how did one rather small Gulf state, emirate, get to be so central to U.S. foreign policy and the strategic equation in the Middle East? How did they parlay their key location in the Persian Gulf and enormous wealth into this anomalous stance as a supposed American ally while also remaining the wingman of the Islamist regime in Iran?
Well, I think they were able to do it because they're not Iran and they're not Saudi Arabia. And in that, they found a space to operate. And, the U.S. is constantly looking for allies in the region and looking to counter this or counter that. And what better position for Qatar to be in than to say, listen, let's host a U.S. base that's crucial to logistical support for Afghanistan and Iraq, and also host the Taliban, and also provide funds to the Islamic jihadist Sunni groups, and counter that with doing the same thing for Iran. So this little, bar in Star Wars, I think I called it that back in 2018 when we had a conference.
Right, you and I were both at a Middle East Forum conference in Washington some 7 years ago, talking about Qatar.
Yeah. At the Spy Museum of all places. And
yes, at the Spy Museum.
How relevant that is today. Because if you're looking at a hostile foreign actor, we have one in Qatar that's cloaked as an ally. And anytime I bring this up, I'm sure anytime you bring this up, we constantly hear, well, they're hosting a U.S. base. Like, well, we don't have to let them do that. Let's make Qatar's investment in America a bad return on investment, because having a base there should give us leverage. It shouldn't give the Qataris leverage. It shouldn't give Hamas leverage. It shouldn't give Tehran leverage. And in the case of the Iraqi base, the same parameters are in place. The Iraqi government doesn't let us use that base to go after Shia militias. Doesn't let us use that base to defend against Iran's attack on Israel. And the same thing with Incirlik in Turkey. We can't use that base to do certain things. Having a base, hosting a U.S. base, should give the United States leverage. Instead, we continue to cede that leverage to frenemies. Turkey's position on Israel right now is one that I would consider an enemy position. Turkey's support for Jelani in Syria, an enemy position. Qatar has the same position that Turkey has, but worse. They have the money to fund these organizations. They have the money to influence U.S. politicians. And as we're going into Saturday, with high-level U.S. talks with Iran in Oman, Qatar has told Tehran everything they need to know about how to exploit Witkoff's, the U.S. envoy in this situation, his vulnerabilities, his weaknesses. And there are a lot of weaknesses based on what we've been able to see. And that weakness, the biggest weakness that I've been talking about, is his affinity for Qatar. And it's tied to a $623 million bailout in a bad investment he had in New York. Qatar was able to bail him out of that situation. And you got to question that. Is that disqualifying? Should that disqualify him from this position? I think it should. He's compromised I shouldn't say compromising that he is an asset, but for Qatar, he's compromised because they can push him in directions they want him to go. And he's continually done that.
Yeah, I want to drill down into Witkoff in a minute, but let's frame this issue. In our discussion of Qatar's stance as this uniquely two-faced ally, how does this undermine American policy on terrorism and the Iranian nuclear program? Other than hosting that airbase, what is Washington getting out of this relationship? Because we know what they're getting out of the relationship.
Well, it's an excellent return on investment for Qatar, because they're basically able to, take a local chamber of commerce from a key state that they want to influence, because there's a senator or a congressperson that influences U.S. foreign policy in that state, and they inject economic stimulus. And in return, they have the ability to call a senator and have that call answered, call a congressman and have that call answered. So they're able to put so much money, and when I say so much money, it doesn't ever have to be a lot. Look how easy it is to influence U.S. think tanks. $10,000 here, $40,000 here, $10,000 a month, $40,000 a month. The ability to place pro-Qatar op-eds in key American papers that influence key senators and congressmen. So that's one small aspect of it. But look at the day after October 7th. All these protests that were ready to go with placards and all these front groups. And if you simply follow the money back, you'll see that it goes to Qatar, that it goes to Tehran through Qatar. That's where it began. So Qatar is not only hosting a U.S. base, they are a bank that basically allows a flow through of Iranian money, a regime money, to proxies, and Qatar funds those as well. Any negotiated position that Qatar has played a part in, whether it be the Bo Bergdahl release in Afghanistan during the Obama administration, where the Taliban gets back 5 dangerous terrorists and we get back a deserter. That is a Qatari negotiated outcome. When we look at 5 Americans, dual citizens that Tehran held as pawns, Qatar brokers an agreement with the United States to unfree $6 billion in assets. That money is fungible. Tehran uses it to continue the support of terrorism, and Qatar uses it as an example of, look, we helped you do this. And they think that gives them gravitas, it gives them capital with the U.S. politicians, and it does. But behind every protest after October 7th, behind every failed U.S. policy when it came to Hamas, when it came to Iran, when it came to the Taliban, Qatar was at the table. And that's what Americans need to know. But one of the things you and I both struggle with, how do we get Americans who are concerned about their 50-meter target, taking care of their families, taking care of their kids, making sure their children go to good schools, how do we get them to pay attention to this? And my only argument is that 5-year-old kid that you care about that's going to school might have to fight in a future war that Qatar funded. Funded a terrorist group that attacked America. So I struggle in trying to get Americans to notice and care about it. In DC, they know about it, but like I said, I've said this many times on Twitter, there are many people here in DC that would not be able to pay their mortgage if they criticize Qatar.
Yeah, that is a sobering thought. But let me ask you about these negotiations that you mentioned and that are obviously, they've been in the headlines the last few months with the Hamas ceasefire hostage deal and now the prospect of new talks with Iran. Is it necessary to have a broker dealing with Hamas and Iran like Qatar? Would we have to invent them if they didn't exist? Or are they actually working to undermine American interests and boost our adversaries every time they engage in such negotiations?
See, we fail to realize, and I've been trying to make this point, Qatar does not have influence on the regime in Tehran. Qatar does not have influence with Hamas. Qatar's influence is with us. So they sell that influence to Tehran. They sell that influence to Hamas, saying, work with us and we'll get you the best negotiated outcome. And in each case, I would argue that Qatar acts as the agent for Tehran, the agent for Hamas. And we think they're an honest broker, and they're not. They're not a third party.
Is there somebody else that could play that role that would be an honest broker? Or are we just stuck with them? I guess because that's the pushback I get when I bring this up, that like, what alternative is there? Is there an alternative? Do we really need them or not?
Well, we need to remember we're the United States and that we can deal directly with Tehran if we have the intestinal fortitude to do so, and the backbone to do so. We don't need a mediator. It can take place in Oman. It can take place with other people there. But the direct conversation should always be between the United States and Tehran. We basically outsourced that to the Russians and the Chinese under the Biden administration for JCPOA negotiations, to the point where Russia and China both had a front row view of the lack of backbone in Washington, D.C. They could not believe how much the Iranians were getting away with. So when it comes to Qatar, that's the same argument. Where else are we going to put this base? And I always say Bahrain, UAE, somewhere else, anywhere else.
A more friendly country.
In a more friendly country that realizes that if you host it, it gives us leverage. It doesn't give you leverage. It gives you protection because we have a U.S. base there, but you don't get to use it as leverage that benefits Tehran, that benefits Russia, that benefits an adversary. And that's what we've seen with Qatar. That's what we've seen in Baghdad, for that matter. That's what we've seen in Incirlik, in Turkey with our U.S. base in Incirlik. So what choice do we have? Any other choice is better than this. This is an ally that has squandered its worthiness of being an ally. And the Biden administration rewarding it in 2022 with this major non-NATO U.S. ally status and extending the 10-year lease. Cancel both of those. Use those as leverage. Or when Erdogan takes a pro-Muslim Brotherhood, pro-Al-Qaeda position in Syria and an anti-Israel position to the point where he says Israel must be destroyed, that should be a position where the U.S. is saying, listen, you're no longer in NATO because we decide who's in NATO. We are the main player in NATO, and we don't use those things as leverage. And Democrats who are against kinetic power, who are against hard power, will say, well, that's smart power. Use the threat of sanctions, use the threat of disfavor to get an adversary or a frenemy to do something. And they're even against that at this point. So the only tools we really have are the U.S. banking system, right? Sanctions. But all of our adversaries are trying to bypass that by using a different currency where they don't have to worry about the U.S. banking system. So once we get that leverage taken away when it comes to sanctions, what are we going to do? And our adversaries need to believe that the kinetic option is always on the table, but there are disfavor options. There are a lot of things we can do, and we don't do it because we send people over. This real estate foreign policy that we're seeing from the Trump administration is basically a 4-year ceasefire where our enemies can rebuild, regroup, rejoin the economy for the day after Trump leaves. So it's a very dangerous situation if your only foreign policy is to delay an attack. The attack comes the day after.
Yeah, kind of like the Obama nuclear deal, which was just kicking the can down the road and ensuring that Iran would sooner or later get a nuclear weapon.
Exactly. Everything that happened when Biden was president was a result of our adversaries either being told to wait or believing there was peace through strength or believing there was a deterrence message. But the president is operating very differently in this administration. He's made those do this or else threats to Hamas 3 times with no actions afterwards. So that bravado, that capital that he had with the Middle East after taking out Qasem Soleimani in 2020 is gone because he's not sending Rubio over there to do this. He's sending Witkoff over there to do this, and Witkoff is employing a real estate foreign policy. Let's do business together. And in doing business with America, you get the protections of doing business with America. But what happens the day after when our adversaries want more than business, when our adversaries want territory? And that's what we know China wants. That's what we know Russia wants. And that's what we know Hamas and Iran want. They want to take territory away from Israel and in that sense when it comes to Hamas and Tehran.
Yeah, explain for our viewers who, aren't in the weeds on this. A lot of, the other Gulf states are pretty hostile to Iran. They fear Iran. Why is Qatar in bed with Iran? What led to that? I mean, was it just a strategic thing, or is it their rivalry with the Saudis? What created this weird alliance?
Well, part of it's Qatar's support for the Muslim Brotherhood, right, has pushed it into a corner. So those Gulf allies that are worried about Iran are also against the Muslim Brotherhood. In Egypt and Northern Africa is against it as well. The Middle East, MENA is against the Muslim Brotherhood, and Qatar is for it. And that puts it in that situation where it needs to.
They host the Muslim Brotherhood,
Right,
which is
right.
related to Hamas. They host its leading, ideologue.
Created Hamas.
Yeah,
It's from Hamas.
right,
I'm sorry, it's from the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas is from the Muslim Brotherhood.
right.
It does that, and then again, this balancing, capability that this country has. It's smart the way they balance things. So we're for the Muslim Brotherhood. All of our allies know we're nobody in that region trusts Qatar. Every relationship is a financial one. So and they know what Qatar is. So Qatar leans towards Tehran for that protection in a way, but it's paid for again. That there is no protection from Iran. It's basically every relationship Qatar has with a terrorist organization or a terrorist regime is one where the regime gets rewarded or the terrorist organization gets rewarded for not attacking Qatar, for not conducting attacks inside of Qatar, for portraying this position that Qatar somehow is the only country you can use to talk to Al Qaeda, the only country you can use to talk to Hamas or Iran or other groups, and it benefits from that. And then you have spineless, weak Americans in positions that will take Qatari money. And there was nothing more glaring than Marshall from Kansas, Senator Marshall from Kansas, and his 180 on Qatar. And that was directly tied to a trip, a Chamber of Commerce trip, an investment committee trip to Kansas that changes position. That's how easy it is. This soft power that Qatar uses to influence American politicians. And then again, they go into a balancing position. Well, yes, I support Qatar post October 7th, but I'm also against men and women's bathrooms. So I'm a good guy. No, that's easy to do. Mm-hmm. The Qatar thing is a betrayal of, your country in this regard. If you criticize Qatar, there's a financial consequence for you. If you praise Qatar, there's a financial reward for you. That is a foreign country exerting foreign influence on a U.S. politician, which should be criminal.
Yeah, I agree. Let's drill down now into the question of Steve Witkoff, President Trump's Middle East envoy. You've mentioned this about his business connections to Qatar. Right. Is there any explanation for his willingness to show for them? And I don't think there's any other way to put it other than money. Or are they so good at this influence game that they've actually convinced him that they're straight shooters and good people?
Well, Jonathan, I spent a lot of time in the Middle East as an intel officer, and I sat in meetings with U.S. principals, meeting with counterparts in the Middle East. And I can't tell you how easy it is to make an American think that somehow you've convinced them to change your ways. I've seen
We're that naive, is what you're saying?
No, we want to be liked. There's this thing about the hubris of the American four-star general, the American Secretary of State, that believes that whoever's sitting across the table from them is not going to lie, is going to realize in what, great company they're in, and realize that the moment is bigger than they are. And I've seen bad people agree with well-intentioned Americans, and it was a lie, meaning we want you to do this. And the Middle East person on the other side will say, yes, I understand your concerns. It's very difficult, but I understand what you're saying. And that right there is enough to convince an American that they have a partner. And all that is being polite. It's the culture to listen to somebody, to hear them out. It doesn't mean you're going to do a thing about it. And I've had this conversation with General Petraeus, with H.R. McMaster, with other people inside of the State Department who came out of a meeting saying, well, that was great. I'm like, that's not what the meeting was about.
And those are people with reputations as, hard-headed. They're distinguished, really, H.R. McMaster is really smart. Petraeus is really smart.
You can be smart reading a book. You can be smart, describing something, making something less complicated for an American to understand by being an expert. But when you sit across from somebody, that's a different game because you have to have a good, BS detector, right?
Hmm.
You have to know that that person on the other side knows who you are, knows how they can influence you, knows who you're reporting to, and knows what you want to hear.
Mm. Yeah,
And
that last part especially, right?
you have to know that. So
Mhm.
so when you're sitting there, so if I was Witkoff, I would go meet with the Qataris and say, we got to talk to Hamas and they got to release everybody because I don't know what this crazy bastard in DC is going to do. Okay. He's told
Mhm.
me that all these things are on the table. We want to avoid that. So we need to do this. And did Witkoff do that? He did not do that. What Witkoff did was he went and sat across from somebody who said, yes, we understand, but it's very difficult. There's more to it than just Israel being right or Israel getting their hostages back. So we have to, and you're sitting there like, yeah, okay, well, we heard some people say some crazy things. Well, they're not all bad guys, or maybe Hamas has a point of view that we should listen to. Witkoff has said those things. That tells
Mm.
me that he sat across from somebody who just basically not told him what he wanted to hear based on who he was going to report to. And asking the Qataris if they think Hamas will do this, and the Qataris are going to say no, is not a good answer.
Yeah.
Mr. President, they're not going to do this. This is what they're willing to do. I'm
This
still
is kind of the weak diplomacy, as I think you've already said, that we were accustomed to from the Obama and Biden administrations. It's not what we expect from Trump, who had certainly a strong record in the Middle East during his first term. Is this just personnel here? Is this like, he's tapped the wrong real estate crony? Because some of his previous real estate cronies, whether it was David Friedman or, Jason Greenblatt, it's like or even his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, whatever you might think of them, they came up with some better diplomacy. They actually achieved results that I don't think Steve Witkoff has a hope of doing.
Well, I mean, Jared Kushner did great things, right, with the
Mhm.
Abraham Accords, but now he's partnered up with the Qataris and is out of government.
Yeah.
And Witkoff and I get it, right? Because you can make the argument, well, they're an ally, Mike. They're a U.S. ally, so
Mhm.
because they're supporting terrorists. But let's talk about Witkoff being similar to what the Biden administration had. I would say when it came to Blinken, McGurk, Jake Sullivan, and Malley, they all had agendas. They had
Yeah.
agendas. They were smart people who had an agenda that I disagree with. Uh, Witkoff's
Yeah, they
agenda,
wanted a realignment of U.S.,
right,
foreign policy that would include Iran. They wanted, as Obama said, Iran to have a chance to get right with the world that they didn't actually want.
right.
This is something different. This seemed just incompetence, pure,
I,
naivete being
I
bought off.
disagree with I disagree with everything Malley was doing, everything McGurk was doing, everything Blinken was doing with regards to Iran. But they were still smart people. They just had an agenda. They had the Obama agenda to balance everything. If Iran had more of a say, they naively believed that the region would be more stable because the Shia are against Sunnis and we're against Al Qaeda, so they'll be against Al Qaeda. And then you and I would say, well, they host Al Qaeda leadership. Osama bin Laden said, "Don't mess with Iran. They're helping us." It's an agenda. You can be naive, but when it comes to real estate foreign policy that we're seeing from the president, when it comes to Ukraine, well, let's get in there and deal with all the minerals, and therefore we'll have business, and therefore we'll have interest, and then we won't let Russia invade because we'll have a stake. And then saying the same thing to the Taliban now. I don't know if you've heard this, but we're talking about going back into Afghanistan in order to exploit the minerals under the guise of being counter Islamic State Khorasan. It's business foreign policy that has a shelf life of 4 years,
Mm.
right? Um, and then when it comes to Witkoff, I don't see why. The president said, listen, it always helped having a guy like Bolton in the room with me because they would say, if you don't do what I'm going to say, I'm going to let this guy influence my decisions. He's taken Bolton away and replaced it with a a Warren Christopher type if Warren Christopher didn't have experience.
Warren Christopher, who was Bill
Right, Jimmy
Clinton's
Carter's secretary,
secretary.
right?
Excuse me, Jimmy Carter. They kind of
Right, Jimmy
flow
Carter's
together.
secretary
Yes,
of
Warren
state.
Christopher going back even further.
Just milk
Yeah.
toast, right? But
Mhm.
Witkoff isn't milk toast. Witkoff is self-serving. The Qatar relationship benefits Witkoff's real estate ventures. His son is praising Qatar as much as his father is. And there's
Yeah.
no reason to do that. And now with Tehran, it's like, well, listen, we have oil and gas in Tehran. Let's open up that market. Let's see what we can do. Not knowing that the Chinese have already invested $450 billion in Iran's infrastructure. They already own it. They already own the rail, the road, the Silk Road initiatives.
In addition to buying Iran's oil and therefore
Exactly.
keeping
And the
them
Russians
afloat.
already got the water rights. So
Mhm.
there is no economy to exploit in Tehran other than the oil and the gas. But there's no way you do that with the regime. And then the argument would be like, listen, the regime would collapse if they did business with us. So let's get them in business with us, because the regime would no longer be able to say death to America, death to Israel if we're doing business with them. So there's all these arguments, but I don't think our enemies can be strategic, and our enemies can wait out Trump.
Mhm.
The big man, everything he wants to hear through a guy like Witkoff, who's going to say, hey, boss, or hey, best friend that we go golfing with, we go golfing together. They're in my pocket. And the truth is, he'll be in their pocket.
Yeah.
He'll be in Qatar's pocket. Tehran knows every weakness that Witkoff has. They probably knew it on their own, but now they have Qatar to help with that, based on what we've seen. Putin knows Witkoff's weaknesses. He made him wait for 8 hours, before meeting with him. And then he walked away. And what did Witkoff do? Shed the same praise on Putin that he did on Qatar. So I don't know what he's doing. If this is a good cop, bad cop strategy, I'm waiting for the good cop to show up.
I'm waiting for the bad cop. Yeah, right. He's playing the good cop with them. Yeah.
They don't have a good cop, bad cop here. They have a dumb cop, a paid off cop, a weak cop. And I should be more constructive, right? I've criticized Witkoff quite a bit, but it's been warranted. You don't say things like that on TV every time you get a chance. You don't go on Tucker Carlson and praise Qatar and Putin. Why? For what reason? For what benefit? We don't have to try to keep them on our side. They want to be utilized. You can ask for more. You can make every investment they have in you a bad ROI, meaning every investment they have in the United States, a bad ROI. More Americans need to tell Qatar what Hamas tells Qatar. Give me your money or else.
Yeah. Right. Well, that leads to my next question, which you've already sort of taken a dip into, which is, I think there are a number of reasons that might explain President Trump's willingness to engage in negotiations with Iran, and principally his desire to avoid another Middle Eastern war.
Right.
But Witkoff notwithstanding, do you think the Qataris have the ability to convince Trump to accept another terrible nuclear deal as Obama did? Or do you think that this is ultimately going to fail if they don't, do what Trump says, he says what he wants, or do they think they can actually buy off the entire administration?
Well, I mean, here's all they have to do, right? They have Witkoff.
Mm-hmm.
They have Kushner. No, what I'm saying, they have access to both of them. They can influence the president. I'm not worried about them trying to convince J.D. Vance of anything, or Pete Hegseth of anything, or Tulsi Gabbard of anything, because I don't think they see them as major influencers on the president. They're there at the presidents can replace them any day.
Right.
But when it comes to Kushner and his best friend Witkoff, there's a reason they bailed Witkoff out in 2023. They knew how close he was to the guy who had just won the Republican, nomination.
Mm-hmm.
He was going to be president. And if he wasn't, he was still going to be influential in the Republican Party. The Republican Party, it was Trump's. So they're smart about this. So
tell us more about
Trump?
that bailout, because it hasn't gotten a lot of attention.
It's in the New York Times. Something. I mean, we should. It's in the New York Times. They gave his real estate venture $623 million because he bought a hotel that was a bad investment. He couldn't sell it. Nobody wanted to buy it. He was going to be, in the red, What's the bad one? The black or the red? Always, for me as a military guy, red's always bad, but red's good, right?
Right.
Anyway, it was a bad real estate investment. He thought he could turn around the Park Hotel, whatever the hotel it was in New York City, and the Qataris gave him $623 million. And guess what? Everything's great. He's well placed. He could tout it as a success. And now he's looking to expand. Where do you think all this, hey, this is a great piece of property, we should kick everybody out and develop here? Where do you think that came from? That's Witkoff looking at Gaza and saying, wow, we could do a lot here. This real estate foreign policy position, I think, is too easily exploited by wealthy countries like Qatar. I mean, the Saudis can do the same thing, right? And we'll give the Saudis a pass because the Saudis are against Iran. The Saudis are willing to talk about the Abraham Accords under the table when it comes to Israel. I mean, they're allies. We know that. It's just under the table. And the Saudis don't have the same, effectiveness in supporting terrorist groups that Qatar has, that Iran has. The Saudis will throw money at a group and say, inshallah, you'll do the right thing. The regime marries that proxy, and there is no divorce. Qatar funds that proxy, and Tehran is the enforcer. And, Saudi just doesn't have that enforcing mechanism other than turning on and turning off money. The Qataris aren't on anyone's radar. Like you said, they are now, as close as they got inside of the Netanyahu's.
I want to get to that later. Yeah.
Sure. So it's easy, right? Americans want to be liked, and our adversaries exploit that, especially our Middle East chess playing adversaries know how to exploit the American who wants to be liked.
And now a word about our sponsors. At the heart of the Jewish people is a promise that ensures our traditions, values, and future endure for generations. The Jewish Future Promise is a movement I endorse. It is a moral commitment to securing that future. By signing the promise, we commit to keeping Jewish life vibrant and thriving for the next generation. Join me in shaping the future. Make your promise today. Sign the promise. jewishfuturepromise.org/sign the promise. One of the more disturbing examples of Qatar's successful effort to market itself as a moderate and reliable U.S. partner is the way some on the right, we're used to the left, being appeasers, but some on the right, most prominently Tucker Carlson, whom you've already mentioned, who presumably ought to know better, have bought their line about Iran hook, line, and sinker. Why are these people so vulnerable to Qatari efforts to spin Iranian terror as not a threat? Is it their animus for Israel, the money, or all of the above?
Well, their baseline is genuine in that Iraq was a failure, Afghanistan was a failure. We gave Iraq back to Iran after 20 years, or we gave Iraq to Iran on a silver platter after 20 years of repeated failure. Mm-hmm. And we gave Afghanistan back to the Taliban. So there's a baseline that's genuine in that I'm against forever wars. I'm against this. And in some cases, Ukraine is therapy for generals who lost in Afghanistan, who lost in Iraq, who now have the easiest job ever. Keep the weapons and the munitions going to the Ukrainians. They want to fight for their territory. We have a dedicated ally. And then you have the let's not do this again position of a Tulsi Gabbard, of a Tucker Carlson, but it's based in things we won't ever do again. We're never going to invade a country with hundreds of thousands of Americans again, because we realize in our democracy, you have 2 years to get something done. If you don't get that war finished in 2 years, then it's going to have mission creep. It's going to go down these long roads where you have successes and failures, 2 steps forward, 3 steps backwards. We weren't in Iraq for 20 years. We were there 20 times, 1 year at a time with a different strategy. Same thing for Afghanistan. So when it comes to Tucker Carlson saying we can't go to war with Iran. We'll lose thousands of Americans. He's thinking invasion. Going to war with Iran are surgical strikes against key regime positions that will get the regime to do what it's always done since it took power in 79. It backs down after punched in the face. Operation Praying Mantis, where Reagan takes out half of their navy in 1988. Qasem Soleimani, I would argue the equivalent of Iran's navy, taken out in 2020. Anything that the United States does against Iran's nuclear program or to set back the regime will be an air campaign with a high success rate. And, it's the alarmists, the Cassandras that have no basis in being genuine in their concerns about a war, like a Tucker Carlson, like a Tulsi Gabbard and others that say we can't do this. Tulsi Gabbard's position when she testified a couple weeks ago as DNI on the threat took the same position she took in 2015 when I engaged her as director of Veterans Against the Iran Deal. She said, Iran is not pursuing a nuclear weapon. I've seen the intel. And the intel was basically the Iranians using our signal intelligence capabilities as a public relations platform. Basically saying, hey, I'm so-and-so, I'm in charge of Iran's nuclear program, and I'm adhering with all, UN Security Council resolutions, and I'm adhering with the framework of the JCPOA. That becomes a top secret SEI code word signet that got passed around. And I met with Congressman Liu, and he said the same thing. I've seen the intelligence. And I said, did it sound something like this? I'm so-and-so. I'm in charge of this directorate. And he said, yes. I said, that's messaging. Because I've seen that since 2005 from our adversaries, because they know our capabilities and they know that for some reason, NSA needs to get this out of their culture. The voice interceptor listening to an adversary believes that the adversary is not lying if they don't know they're being listened to.
Yeah, they all think that they're the code breaker before the Battle of Midway.
And it's all...
When instead they're just being played.
They're being played because our adversaries know that we're listening, and they know that if they say something of consequence, it'll go to the president. It'll go to key members of Congress and the Senate. It's called a critic report. And we have criteria in the intel community where if you hear a high-level person talk about their nuclear program, a terrorist attack, an adversary, it becomes a high-level intelligence report that will go directly to key decision makers, and our adversaries know that. And I will tell you this, when our Secretary of Defense, our Secretary of State, our Director of National Intelligence, our envoy to Russia, Middle East, wherever else Witkoff is going, all showed up on a Signal chat. That became the equivalent of a critic to Xi Jinping and to Putin and to the supreme leader, that all of them were on this platform. Now, Iran may not be able to penetrate this platform, but we know the Chinese and the Russians can. So that's
and the Atlantic.
Yeah, exactly. But that's part of my brand. It's not very lucrative being the controversial dinner guest or saying it like it is, but I think
you're always welcome at our table, Mike.
I appreciate it. But there needs to be a place for this. There needs to be a place to call balls and strikes, for lack of a better metaphor.
Yeah. Well, I think we need to point out, as we're talking about Qatar and its influence operation, that it's bipartisan. I mean, one prominent example among Democrats who fell into their sphere of influence was disgraced former New Jersey Senator Robert Menendez. Well, that was both egregious and exposed. It's far from the only example of politicians who are connected to them, isn't it? You mentioned one senator, but is it as easy as just investing in something small in a state or in a district, and then they get it's like people complain about AIPAC, but like this seems a lot more effective.
We got the Qataris host concerts. They bribe their way to get the World Cup there. They buy Harley Davidson dealerships. They portray themselves as this Texan hybrid Arab in the Middle East, when in fact they're pro-Muslim Brotherhood. They're anti-Israel. They're pro-Tehran. Rich people buying American influence. So you just mentioned Menendez. When your viewers watch this, have them Google Menendez, and in the headline it's going to say Egypt. It's not going to say Qatar. Qatar's already
Right.
influenced the media to take Qatar out of that headline, and it's 6 paragraphs down in the news story. It's Qatar that had the money to pay off Menendez. Egypt was also involved, but Qatar had the money.
They have the gold. Yeah.
Look at what Lindsey Graham's position has been after going, after a visit to South Carolina. Look at Nikki Haley's position. Look at how the position wasn't necessarily a pro-Qatar position, but it was an anti-Saudi Arabia position. It was an anti the things that Qatar cared about.
Mhm.
And then we haven't even talked about Al Jazeera yet. We haven't even
That was my next question.
Right.
Let's talk about Al Jazeera, and it's key to their influence operations. How did they use this outlet to advance their agenda, undermine the U.S. and Israel, while it's still taken seriously by a lot of influential people? And how have they managed to influence media that they don't even own?
In 2005 in Iraq, a lot of people don't know this. If we saw a cameraman from Al Jazeera over a bridge watching a U.S. convoy, we were allowed to shoot a warning shot because we knew that they were filming an imminent attack by Al Qaeda.
Mm.
So they've been supporting terrorists for a long time.
Talk about
So
being
US
embedded,
military,
right?
Yeah, I mean, you look at October 7th. Look at our journalist was killed, and then they show him actually, participating on October 7th. It's Al Jazeera. Any position they take is an anti-American position, or it's a divisive one. They like to sow discontent, foment violence in other countries. With the George Floyd crisis, they were all over that, trying to divide Americans. With the elections, they're always there, but they have a position, and they should be treated just like Russian television. They're basically state-sponsored media that supports Hamas, yet somehow U.S. decision makers have not held Qatari leadership responsible for what they impose on Al Jazeera. So Al Jazeera supports Hamas, and the emir supports Al Jazeera and Hamas, but the emir is meeting with U.S. businessmen post October 7th, like Bill Aikman and others who have taken very strong positions with regards to Israel and the funding in these universities, and not knowing that when you say that you're going to withhold your donation to your alma mater, that Qatar is simply filling that void. They put so much money into American universities. They know how to do it. They're so smart. It doesn't take a lot. Let's influence this Middle East department at MEI to take a pro-Qatar position, the Middle East Institute. Let's influence Brookings here. Remember General Allen got in trouble for taking, $20 million from the Qataris?
Yeah.
Anyway, so easy to do.
That's an important point here, because they are, on the one hand, Qatar is still, I believe, the primary spread of money towards Islamist radicalism around the world in terms of funding madrasas for Muslims, but also Middle East studies departments at major elite universities.
It's easy to do. Look at Texas A&M, had to kick them out of the university because they were stealing intellectual property related to a U.S. nuclear program. This country funded in some way every protest in Europe post October 7th, every protest in the United States post October 7th. Continue to do that. Continue to put out these false numbers about 50,000 Gazans have been killed in indiscriminate targeting. When have that number, just have it, and 50% of those guys are either PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or Hamas. And even Hamas has admitted that most of the casualties are military-aged males.
Yeah.
72% of the casualties are military-aged males out of the 50,000. And the media runs with that, and Qatar does that. Any university who has a satellite campus in Doha is compromised. Any media outlet that has a satellite office in Doha will not criticize Qatar ever, and will have to go on some PR charm offensive to defend Qatar if they actually get in trouble. I mean, we have to look at even they gave Newsmax $50 million. Remember, after the election, after 2016, Fox News was moving in a direction. Newsmax was getting deplatformed off of DirecTV and other media outlets. So Qatar comes to the rescue and gives Newsmax, a conservative media outlet,
Yeah,
$50
which
million.
we're friendly, which we like going on.
Yeah. And guess who they have on to talk about whether or not we should go to war with Iran or whether or not we should support Israel. It ends up being people that have this, because we failed in Iraq and Afghanistan, we should never do anything ever mentality. And, it wasn't the military guy on the ground that failed. It was a politician back in D.C. that failed. There's a politician back in D.C. that was risk averse that failed. It was a politician back in D.C. that wanted to off ramp and do something else, only to off ramp there. If we look at Afghanistan when it comes to Biden. So our adversaries have the benefit of watching us, John, watching our country and seeing, okay, they're going to be strong for 2 years. Then they're going to go into an election cycle with a competition to be president in 2028. And it's not going to be J.D. Vance. And Rubio is definitely going to run. We have no idea who it's going to be. And so they're just going to wait it out. And if it's a Democrat, then they have a permissive environment again. But I would argue that our adversaries have a permissive environment in the Trump ceasefire, real estate, foreign policy strategy. It's all about incentivizing our adversaries, whether it's Putin, whether it's Iran, whether it's, Qatar, in order for nothing to happen while he's president. If the goal is to make sure nothing happens on your watch, it means the day after the world is in a very dangerous position.
Yeah, well, we have to hope that President Trump comes to his senses on that, or just doesn't listen to Witkoff. But we'll see how that plays out. Let's turn to something you mentioned a couple of minutes ago. Recently, two of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's advisors were accused of being paid off by Qatar and acting under their influence. What do you make of this case? There's an argument that it's another example of the Israeli deep state seeking to undermine Netanyahu, or do you think there's fire behind this smoke? And while in retrospect, let me just add that it was a mistake for Israel to use Qatar to buy what it hoped was a continued ceasefire with Hamas before October 7th, was this kind of a trap all along?
Well, it's the best. So what do? You're Qatar. You get the green light from the Obama administration and Netanyahu to finance Hamas. The real ask was to open up back channels so that we can negotiate with Hamas. But apparently the Netanyahu side of it is, let's make them fat, dumb, and happy so they never get aggressive. And what did they do? They were strategic with it. They used that money to build tunnel networks. They used that money to train. They somehow got 500 operatives to Iran to train and then got them back into Gaza to conduct this attack. So is it paying off? Absolutely, it's paying off for Qatar. And then what you do is you shore up your bet by getting influence inside of Netanyahu's office that discredits Egypt, who is a staunch, anti-Muslim Brotherhood, partner, U.S. ally, right? At least on the surface. Sisi is anti-Muslim Brotherhood, but Sisi's also.
Yeah, well, they also, the border with Egypt and Gaza was also porous, so we can't entirely trust them either.
Again, on the surface, anti-Muslim Brotherhood, and on the surface, that trade wasn't happening. It was those tunnels underneath that I actually got to see when I was in Rafah, Philadelphia corridor. And I guess they call it the Swedish city, or that little part there, right there by the beach, where that big tunnel is, where you can drive a big truck through it. But Qatar's. I looked at how Qatar did it. They basically used an American that worked for Clinton and Kerry, who had a company. He was personally registered as a foreign agent for Qatar, but he used his PR company to basically hire these two guys to put favorable stories about Qatar in the newspaper and discrediting Egypt, or, commentary. So it's not hard. $40,000 a month gets you somebody close to Netanyahu, gets you somebody who will answer the phone call. And it's not hard to do. Again, Middle East departments at American universities, Middle East departments inside of think tanks, key Republicans and Democrats that sit on key committees that Qatar wants to influence. You eject economic stimulus. Qatar is so good at this. I have a friend of mine who's a consultant, and I have several friends who take money from Qatar. I shouldn't say friends. I should say, acquaintances
Okay.
who have told me I had to take you off Facebook and Instagram and Twitter because the Qataris said, you know that guy? You follow that guy? So it's that they will lose their consulting gig. They will lose simple things. And these relationships, not like the emir is saying it. It's the tier of the royal family that has all the money, that speaks perfect English, that went to school at Georgetown, that lobbies here inside of Washington, D.C., that drives a nice car, that hangs out in Middleburg and Leesburg, and, enjoys all the fine things that the area has to offer. And the main goal is to influence U.S. foreign policy. And how easy is it, if you're an American who can look yourself in the mirror and say, well, they're an ally. That's why I take their money. To me, I couldn't do it.
Yeah, that's pretty discouraging to hear stories like that. Before we go, I want to ask you one question that's sort of off Qatar,
Right.
at least to some extent. And that is about Syria and this new regime in Syria, Jalani. Already there's a debate. There are people who are saying, "Oh, let's support it, let's invest in it. He's reformed. Yeah, he used to be Al Qaeda, but he's wearing a suit now." We've heard that before, but it's sort of a Mahmoud Abbas argument. But what should we think about this regime in Syria, and how dangerous is it, and how important is it not to fall for this influence operation?
So I say this all the time. It's Jelani from Harakat. No, not Harakat. It's from the Al Nusra Front.
Mhm.
It is an Al Qaeda leader from an Al Qaeda group that ISIS refused to join and went, basically said, you go your way and we'll do our thing here. Jelani changed the name so it wouldn't be sanctioned to Harrir Tariq al-Sham, whatever it is, HTS. And it works because U.S. diplomats are like, well, we can't target HTS because they're not designated. It's Jabhat al-Nusra. It is the al-Nusra Front. You can still target it. It just changed its name. If you look at all the militias created in Iraq that assume responsibility for an attack on U.S. bases, it's always a brand new organization that hasn't been sanctioned yet, believing that if you haven't been sanctioned, because Brett McGurk said, if you're not a foreign terrorist organization, we won't attack you. If you're a Shia group, we won't attack you because the what do you call it? The whatever the act we put together after 9/11, that we could only attack Sunni groups that were responsible for 9/11. But anyway, the Authorized Use of Military Force Act, or military authorization. I know people. Mike Duran from Hudson Institute. Jelani's a great guy. Another buddy of mine. Oh man, he's using his real name now. They don't even call him Jelani anymore. They call him whatever his new name is, just like his new organization is no longer.
Is this Turkish influence working
It
here?
absolutely is Erdogan's position. Even Trump joked about it. Good job taking over Syria with your surrogates. And Erdogan's like, no, I didn't do that. He goes, no, good job.
Yeah, well, that was calling it the way it is. Yeah.
Yeah, listen, Erdogan believes he is the most capable leader inside of the Middle East that could actually do what Osama bin Laden could not do. That actually could do what Baghdadi could not do. And that is to establish a caliphate. And he believes that. And some of my colleagues are caught up in this romance period with the former Turkey as a NATO ally and as a bulwark against Iranian expansion, a bulwark against Sunni jihadism. Remember, it was the Turks who used the Quran to defeat an al-Qaeda-like entity, I think early on, BC, when they were dealing with this thing. It is embarrassing how easy it is to fool an American, to get him to do what you said. Well, let's just wait and see, or let's see if we can work with this guy. You know how easy that is to do? I mean, Jelani's wearing what I'm wearing right now. Yeah. And because a Westerner sees somebody in a sports coat and a shirt, they're like, oh, they have Western principles. We can talk to them because he's not wearing, the man dress. He doesn't look like a jihadist. He's even trimmed his beard, so he doesn't look like a jihadist. That's how easy it is. And we shouldn't be fooled. And, there are not a lot of people pushing back against this. They're saying, oh, we should look. And if you hear his fighters have no problem telling you what they want to do. And I think they made a threat for another October 7th yesterday. Israel will face another October 7th. We will confront Israel in the Golan Heights. We will take back territory. Well, these are Jelani's guys. And,
Yeah, that's a very good argument for Israel holding on to that whole buffer
absolutely.
Zone around
That's
the Golan
why Israel's
Heights.
doing it. That's why Israel had to attack those bases after Assad fell, because they had to go after all of that. They had to go after all of that. But the romance period with Turkey should be over because Erdogan is in charge of it and he's moving it in a very different direction. And his rhetoric, I don't even think it's rhetoric. I mean, it's an honest position that he has when he says Israel should be destroyed.
Yeah, he's been saying it for a while. I mean, it's nothing new. With that,
be a NATO ally. Incirlik is important to, who would you say Erdogan's closer to, Trump or Putin?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Who is Erdogan closer to, Trump or the regime? Erdogan, Trump says, yeah, I like him. I have a good relationship with him. And he needs to be aware of that hubris that he may have, thinking that Erdogan knows that he's dealing with the president of the United States, so he's going to do what I tell him.
Yeah, well, there's nothing wrong with being able to talk to people. It's just, what are you buying and what are they how are they able to
look
influence
at Trump as transitional. He's transitional. They're leaders of their countries. They will always be leaders of their countries, whether or not they're in position, just based on their strongman positions. But Trump is transitional, so they'll wait him out.
Yeah. Well, that's some sobering thoughts about Syria as well as Qatar. Mike, thanks so much for joining us today. These were really important insights that we're not hearing elsewhere. You can follow Mike Pregent on X at MPP Pregent, MP Pregent. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, whether you're listening to us on one of the various podcast platforms, watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel. Please like and or subscribe to JNS. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. Also, a reminder that JNS's inaugural International Policy Summit will be held this April in Jerusalem. Click the link in the description below to request registration in order to attend. And we want to wish everyone a very happy and healthy Passover this coming week. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week. And also, thanks again to our sponsors, the Jewish Future Promise. Sign the promise at jewishfuturepromise.org/sign the promise.